Today we begin with Lukács is the ideology of modernism, from where we left. So we just discussed the notions of different kinds of time. Lukács calls it the problem of time. The experience time as opposed to the subjective time. So I told you about Bergson's discussion of time. Three kinds of time actually Bergson mentions: time, duration and eternity. So here Lukács talks about the way modern novelists used Bergson's concept of time by representing subjective time, which is different from historical time. Next he goes on to talk about Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's writings on Proust. Obviously Proust is a modern novelist who discusses or who makes use of this concept of subjective time in his novel La Recherche de temps perdu, in search of times past, sometimes translated as the remembrance of times past. Lukács writes, Benjamin has well described Proust's vision and the techniques he uses to present it in his great novel. Quoting from Benjamin, we all know that Proust does not describe a man's life as it actually happens, but as it is remembered by a man who has lived through it. Yet this puts it far too crudely, for it is not actual experience that is important, but the texture of reminiscence, the Penelope's tapestry of a man's memory. So the interesting thing about description of somebody's memory is that it is a kind of a tapestry, which is not the original. In a tapestry or in a magic tapestry, somebody weaves a pattern that one imitates from reality. So Penelope in Greek myth and the Lady of Shalott in Tennyson looks at reality and weaves its imitation. So it is a texture, it is a well-made texture. Thus the memory of a person, when it is reconstructed, then it does not follow exactly the reality of events experienced, but weaves it according to his own pattern or his own ideas. The connection with Bergson's theories of time is obvious, but whereas with Bergson, in the abstraction of philosophy, the unity of perception is preserved. Benjamin shows that with Proust, as a result of the radical disintegration of the time sequence, objectivity is eliminated. Bergson as a philosopher takes into account the whole perception by man and preserves this unity of perception in his theory, in his philosophy. But Proust in his novel does not preserve any sequence. The objectivity is entirely eliminated. So it is one of Lukács's important argument in this essay that modernist novelists, they annihilate objectivity. They neglect objective reality. As stream of consciousness novelists like Joyce would represent the flow of psyche of his character, which is very different from the sequence of experience, or Proust represents the memory. So Joyce represents the present flow of thought which also moves into past or sometimes projects into the future. As when Stephen imagines how it would be when he would be a Roman Catholic priest, he would be called Reverend Stephen Dedalus S.J. So projections into the future or looking back into the past can be found in the flow of psyche of Stephen, who thinks about it in the present. Proust narrates everything from the perspective of memory, where the narrator is remembering things happening to him or events, but he is also moving into several layers of the past to and fro, and the narrator does not maintain the exact sequence in which those events happened or were experienced. A lived event is finite, concluded at least on the level of experience, but remembered event is infinite, a possible key to everything that preceded it and to everything that will follow it. How can one pinpoint any particular experience in this wave of remembrance, or these waves of remembrance, we may say, because it is infinite, as Benjamin writes. It is the distinction between a philosophical and an artistic vision of the world. Okay, so I think we explained these lines and we went up to Hugo von Hofmannsthal's poem, by separating time from the outer world of objective reality. The inner world of the subject is transformed into a sinister, inexplicable flux and acquires paradoxically, as it may seem, a static character. That is another argument by Lukács, that in modernist writing or modernist art we find a static character. So let us read the lines by Hofmannsthal once again. It is a thing that no man cares to think on, and far too terrible for mere complaint, that all things slip from us and pass away, and that my ego, bound by no outward force, once a small child before it became mine, should now be strange to me like a strange dog. So in these lines, Hofmannsthal talks about the different egos that he had at different ages. So the ego of a boy, the ego of a grown-up man, the ego of a middle-aged man, these different egos seem to fracture the unity of the man, and therefore the objective reality of the person is kind of destroyed when the poet ventures into this inner world of subjectivity. And therefore Lukács says that it paradoxically seems to be a static character, because the inner world, in the inner world there cannot be any development. The objective world, the world of happenings, in that world there may be development, but the inner world is a world of exploration through memory or by other mental activities. So there cannot be any development, it is static. On literature, this tendency towards disintegration, of course, will have an even greater impact than on philosophy. When time is isolated in this way, the artist's world disintegrates into a multiplicity of partial worlds. So the mental world, or the imagined world, or the remembered world does not have any unity of perception. It disintegrates into multiple worlds. And each of those worlds are partial. The static view of the world, now combined with diminished objectivity, here rules unchallenged. The world of man, the only subject matter of literature, is shattered. A single component is removed. I have shown the consequences of isolating time and reducing it to a subjective category. But time is by no means the only component whose removal can lead to such disintegration. Here again Hofmannsthal anticipated later developments. His imaginary Lord Chandos reflects, I have lost the ability to concentrate my thoughts or set them out coherently. The result is a condition of apathy punctuated by manic fits. The development towards a definitely pathological protest is here anticipated, admittedly in glamorous romantic guise, but it is the same disintegration that is at work. We will come back to these lines once again. So just let us look at what Lukács is arguing here. He says that from this world of man, if any component is removed, then it is shattered. Because the world of man looked at from a realistic point of view, which is Lukács' favored point of view, must have all the components that make us experience it as reality. So if any of the components is removed, then we do not experience it as reality, it becomes something else, it becomes subjective or something else. So here the most important component, the component of time, when this historical time is removed, then there is a kind of disintegration that sets in. And Lukács gives the example of the letter of Lord Chandos written by Hofmannsthal. So I am going to the notes. I will try to show you. So it is called Ein Brief, a letter, usually known as the letter of Lord Chandos or the Chandos letter. It is a prose work written by Hofmannsthal in 1902. So you see, Lukács refers not only to his poems but also to his prose. It is in the form of a letter dated August 1603 from a writer named Lord Philip Chandos, a fictional character, to Francis Bacon, and describes Chandos' crisis of language. It is very interesting to see how repeatedly modernist writers go back to the Renaissance. So here Hofmannsthal presents a fictional character who is a contemporary of Francis Bacon and who is writing to Bacon. Now, he is writing to Bacon about his difficulty with language. Somehow he has some, disturbance in his mental order that he cannot articulate himself in language anymore. Now the question would be, why does he write to Francis Bacon? Most probably because Bacon is the philosopher who tried to give a scientific expression to all subjects, to all knowledge through his writings. And Bacon has his own thoughts on language. He speaks about different idols which are obstacles in the path of a scientific expression. And one of the idols is the idol of the cave, which is the subjective way in which man uses language. So it is appropriate that this character writes about his difficulty with language to Bacon. The letter begins with a summary of the great literary feats that Chandos once achieved. Then Chandos writes of his current mental state. He has reached a crisis point in his career concerning language and its ability to adequately express the human experience. He has abandoned all future written projects because of his inability to express himself in a meaningful fashion. Chandos describes the development of his crisis in stages. First came the loss of the ability to conduct academic discourse on matters of morality or philosophy. Next, he lost the function to make everyday conversation regarding opinions or judgments. Lastly, he turned to the classics, works by Cicero and Seneca, in an attempt to cure his literary ailment, but could make no sense of them, and his condition continued to decline. Chandos describes his state at present as having lost completely the ability to think or speak of anything coherent. He experiences extreme moments of transcendence, while epiphanies on life and spirit overwhelm him. However, these moments are brief in nature, and once they have passed, Chandos is incapable of expressing the insight he uncovered moments before. These epiphanies are the highlight of Chandos' existence, and outside of them his life is stagnant and barren. Chandos often feels he is on the brink of recovery as thoughts begin to form in his mind, but like the epiphanies, they are soon lost in his inability to write. So, you see, the problem here is an epistemological problem, which is enmeshed with the problem of an individual subjectivity. So, the way a person comes to know something, knowledge, the way knowledge is formed, the philosophy that deals with this is epistemology. The way knowledge is formed and the way it is articulated through language, because no knowledge can be formed without being articulated in language. We perceive all knowledge through language. So that very important activity or ability, when it is disturbed, when it does not work anymore, then an overall disintegration sets in. So that is what happens in the case of Chandos. He has lost the ability to concentrate his thoughts or set them out coherently, and a condition of apathy punctuated by manic fits develops. So this development towards a definitely pathological protest is here anticipated, admittedly in glamorous romantic guise. So Lukács says that this psychopathological distemper, when a man fails to articulate anything in language properly, that gives us an example of disintegration of experience. Therefore, Hofmannsthal's letter, Ein Briefe, is an example that Lukács uses to establish that in modernist writing, experience is disintegrated and overall coherence is lost. Previous realistic literature, however violent in its criticism of reality, had always assumed the unity of the world it described and seen it as a living whole, inseparable from man himself. But the major realists of our time deliberately introduced elements of disintegration into their work. For instance, the subjectivizing of time, and used them to portray the contemporary world more exactly. Okay, so here Lukács makes a distinction between previous realistic literature and present realistic literature or modern realistic literature. Obviously, by previous realistic literature, he is thinking probably from Homer, Shakespeare, and the 19th century French novelists, Balzac and others. They have expressed many violent situations, violent in the sense of psychic violence, where which would be a kind of disintegration, but still they present this world as having some kind of unity of perception, because of which we can still make a meaning from this description or this representation. So, if we think of, say, Shakespeare, say, King Lear or Hamlet, these are all attempts at rendering the world of man kind of disintegrating or falling apart because of the violent situation. Nevertheless, in these representations, we can still derive meaning because the unity of perception is not lost. However, when modern realists, so here he has in mind Thomas Mann. Obviously, Lukács is not thinking about Kafka or Joyce. He is thinking about Thomas Mann. When they look at this aspect of disintegration, then what happens? In this way, the once natural unity becomes a conscious constructed unity. I have shown elsewhere that the device of the two temporal planes in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus serve to emphasize its historicity. But in modernist literature, the disintegration of the world of man and consequently the disintegration of personality coincides with the ideological intention. I have highlighted Mann's Dr. Faustus because this is for Lukács one example of modernist writing where historicity is still maintained. So I will just go to my notes on Dr. Faustus by Mann, which will give you an idea why Lukács says that historicity is maintained. This novel is very interesting. It uses the Faust legend, even though its context is the first half of the 20th century and the turmoil of Germany in that period. The composer Adrian Leverkühn is the protagonist, and the narrator is Leverkühn's childhood friend Serenus Zeitblom, who writes in Germany between 1943 and 1946. Kuhn's extraordinary intellect and creativity as a young man mark him as destined for success. He strikes a Faustian bargain for creative genius. He intentionally contracts syphilis, which deepens his artistic inspiration through madness. He is subsequently visited by a Mephistophelian being who says in effect that you can only see me because you are mad does not mean that I do not really exist. And renouncing love, bargains his soul in exchange for 24 years of genius. So Leverkühn is a genius composer, and Mann creates this character in the image of the musician Schoenberg, Arnold Schoenberg. Of course, one could also think of philosophers like Nietzsche, whose life ended in madness and a kind of disintegration. So Leverkühn will have 24 years of genius when he would create great music, but after that he will become completely mad. And he will live for 10 more years after his madness. Before that, before he turns mad, 10 years before his death, he tells his friends how he entered into a bargain with a Mephistophelian being and he created his great work. And after telling them his secret, he turns mad. His madness, his diamond inspiration leads to extraordinary musical creativity. So there is a lot of use of the apocalyptic images, the last judgment, and so on. And Mann is actually portraying, in parallel, the period in Germany that led to the rise and downfall of the Nazi power. So it is a period of German cultural and political crisis, which is given expression in this novel. Now, we will explain why Lukács believes that in this novel historicity is maintained and the device of the two temporal planes helps in maintaining this historicity. What are the two temporal planes? So we go back again. Here I have written Mann was following a theory of or a convention of writing in German in the tradition of German novels, the convention of narrated time and time of narration. In German, Erzähltes Zeit and Erzählzeit. Erzählen is a verb which means to narrate. Erzählte means narrated, Zeit means time. Narrated time and time of narration, Erzählzeit. So what is the time of narration? 1943 to 1946. So this is the time which is the time of, which is the narrated time. So this time has been narrated in the novel later by Zeitblom. So Zeitblom writes from the perspective of his time, which is the time of narration. So these planes of time help Mann emphasizing on the historicity of the novel, because Mann is simultaneously presenting two different planes of time. The time when Zeitblom is telling his story and the time when all that happened. But in modernist literature, the disintegration of the world of man and that of personality coincides with the ideological intention. So now he is thinking of writers like Kafka, Joyce, who have the ideological intention of representing experience as completely disintegrated. Thus, Angst, this basic modern experience, this byproduct of Geworfenheit, has its emotional origin in the experience of a disintegrating society. But it attains its effects by evoking the disintegration of the world of man. So, Geworfenheit is a term from Heidegger, that is the thrownness of being, and it is this thrownness of being which creates angst or anxiety of being. Thrownness of being means that our being in this world is accidental, sudden, and that creates anxiety because we do not know our past or future. So the modernist novelists like Kafka and Joyce and others, they try to represent this angst in their work, and its effects are created by evoking the disintegration of the world of man. Then it comes to the question of allegory. Another important factor or feature, you may say, of modernist writing is allegory. To complete our examination of modernist literature, we must consider the question of allegory. Allegory is that aesthetic genre which lends itself par excellence to a description of man's alienation from objective reality. Allegory is a problematic genre because it rejects that assumption of an immanent meaning to human existence, which, however unconscious, however combined with religious concepts of transcendence, is the basis of traditional art. So you see that this concept of allegory here is rather different from the concept of allegory that we apply to, say, medieval literature. Medieval literature is allegorical literature. Lukács obviously is using the word allegory in a different sense in which critics like Benjamin also use this word allegory. The medieval literature we know is allegorical in the sense that it has double layers of meaning. So the narrated story has one meaning, and it can be explained in terms of religion, and then it has another meaning. But Lukács or Benjamin, they use this term allegory to suggest that when reality is abstracted, then any description of it becomes allegorical. So it essentially suggests an alienation of man from objective reality. Yes.
Sir, I lost you there when you were talking about what Lukács says about allegory.
Yes, I am repeating. Okay. So I am trying to say the distinction between the conventional meaning of allegory, when we apply this as a kind of rhetorical term, we apply this to medieval literature, which is often allegorical. The stories or the poems, they have a layer of meaning which can be interpreted in a religious manner. So there are books on this kind of allegory. C.S. Lewis has a book on allegory. He explains medieval literature. He explains Spencer. In Spencer also we find allegory. But when Lukács is using allegory, or Benjamin uses allegory, they use it in a different sense. They use it with reference to the modern reality. When the modernist writer attempts to represent this reality, the objectivity of this reality is abstracted, is lost. When the objectivity evaporates, then the rendering of this reality becomes a mere allegory, because it does not refer to a real world. This state of affairs is possible when man has been alienated from objective reality. That's where Lukács says that it is par excellence, it is a description of man's alienation from objective reality. It is a problematic ground because it rejects that assumption of an immanent meaning to human existence. When do we assume that human existence has an immanent meaning? When we give our existence a religious interpretation. For all religious interpretations of the world has an immanent meaning, because this meaning is derived from an authentic being, which is God. So because there is some immanent truth or immanent being in the name of God, that is what gives this world a meaning. But in an age when this idea of an all-pervading God which gives meaning to the world is lost, then human existence, which does not have an immanent meaning, becomes an abstract expression which does not have any concept of religious transcendence. Right. So Lukács says that that allegory rejects this assumption of immanent meaning, even though it is unconscious. In an unconscious way, the writer may express the immanent meaning. But modernist writers completely reject any immanent meaning to our experience, any kind of religious transcendence, which we find in traditional art. Therefore, in traditional art we find meaning. in modernistic art we find that meaning evaporates, meaning is lost, and therefore the mode of this kind of writing, Lucas and Benjamin would say that it is allegorical. It is a kind of abstraction, but this abstraction does not have any meaning or any content. So Lucas goes on to give examples. Thus, in medieval art, we observe a new secularity in spite of the continued use of religious subjects, triumphing more and more from the time of Giotto over the allegorizing of an earlier period. Giotto is the painter who more and more represents life which is not religious. A kind of secular meaning can be seen in his paintings. Even if he is painting on religious themes, the figures, the men and women that he paints, they appear to be real men and women with some meaningful existence. So this is a triumph, Lucas says, over medieval allegorizing. That is, in medieval literature, medieval painting, one would always allegorize and give every poem, every painting a religious interpretation. But from Giotto onwards we see that there is an attempt to go beyond the religious meaning. Certain reservations should be made at this point. First, we must distinguish between literature and the visual arts. In the latter, the limitations of allegory can be more easily overcome in that transcendental allegorical subjects can be clothed in an aesthetic immanence, even if of a merely decorative kind, and the rift in reality in some sense will eliminate it. So he says that the case of literature and visual arts are a little different. In visual arts, it is much easier. To overcome the allegorical interpretation or the limitations of allegory, because even if there is no religious immanence, some kind of aesthetic immanence can be materialized, even through decoration or something like that. So he gives the example of Byzantine mosaic art. This decorative element has no real equivalent in literature. It exists only in a figurative sense and then only as a secondary component. So in mosaic art, we see that there could also be representation of a man or a woman, human figure or animals, but they appear to be merely decorative, and therefore they do not mean anything beyond being pretty or beautiful executions. Thus, they do not any longer carry the religious transcendence or the meaning provided by religious transcendence, but they carry an aesthetic immanence, which means that still they have some meaning. Insofar as they are decorative, they are pretty executions. In literature, we have nothing parallel to this. Why? Can you tell me why? Because literature is made of words, and we do not look at words as pictures. We can look at a picture or a pattern, an abstract painting, and just enjoy the coloring, the line drawings and so on without thinking about its meaning. But whenever we read anything composed by words, we always look for meaning of those words. Okay. So that is why in literature there is no such aesthetic immanence as Lucas finds in Byzantine mosaic. Secondly, we must bear in mind in examining allegory, and this is of great importance for our argument, a historical distinction. Does the concept of transcendence in question contain within itself tendencies towards immanence, as in Byzantine art or Giotto, or is it the product precisely of a rejection of these tendencies? So these questions we ask when we read literature, modernistic literature. Then we ask the question whether the concept of transcendence contains tendencies towards immanence, or is it the product of a rejection of these tendencies? So in Byzantine art or Giotto, the painting or the mosaic contains tendencies towards immanence. That is, an immanent meaning is possible. But modernistic literature avoids immanence or rejects these tendencies of immanence. Allegory in modernist literature is clearly of the latter kind. Transcendence implies here, more or less consciously, the negation of any meaning immanent in the world or the life of man. So the words that we have to remember: rejection, negation. So these negative words, Lukács employs them with reference to modernistic literature. So this kind of literature does not have any immanence of meaning or any transcendent meaning. They reject all these tendencies towards immanence, and they negate any possible meaning. We have already examined the underlying ideological basis of this view and its stylistic consequences. Where did he examine this? When he examined the modernistic writers, Musil, Kafka, Joyce, he has examined the ideological basis. So he has spoken about the artistic intention, if you remember. He has spoken about the difference between the artistic intention of Thomas Mann and the artistic intention of Joyce or Kafka. So Thomas Mann, in spite of being a modernist novelist and using many techniques similar to others like Joyce or Kafka, in spite of that, his novels tend to carry some meaningful representation of reality. And that is why he is, according to Lukács, in the great tradition of realists, that tradition which begins for him from Homer through Shakespeare to Balzac and so on. So he comes to kind of conclusion, and we have almost like reached the end of the or close to the end of the essay. But before we actually finish our reading of this essay, we need to look at this concept of allegory that discusses here, and his whole tendency or attempt in the entire essay to explain why in modernistic literature we should not expect any meaning, we should not expect any transcendence or any immanence. Now, if you remember the title of Lukács' book, of which this essay is a part, Meanings in Contemporary Realism. So what is the status of meaning in contemporary realism? That is the subject of his book and his essay. Right. So here he is actually making a very subtle distinction, as you can see, between literature and visual arts. Not absolutely difficult to understand, but he means to, he presents this idea which, in a manner which would be, I suppose, a little more elaborated. He assumes that everybody is familiar with art history and knows Giotto and Byzantine art. But those who are less familiar with art, they will find it a little difficult. However, I have tried to explain that in that Lukács's point here is that in Byzantine mosaic or in Giotto's paintings, there is an attempt to move away from the medieval allegorical interpretation of paintings as some religious interpretation. On the other hand, the figures in Giotto's painting, they appear to be more human. So if we look at medieval, art, medieval painting, you know that in the Middle Ages painting was two-dimensional, and therefore the figures, human or animal, they would look like cardboard figures, and it was not possible for the painter to give any human expression in the faces of these figures. Therefore, these figures appear to be very static in nature, and that is what changes with Giotto. Giotto is at the very beginning or little before the Renaissance. He is at the juncture between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So it is from Giotto that painting begins to take a sense of realistic representation, where human figures, they do not remain any more cardboard figures, but they acquire some kind of three dimension. So this perfection of representing figures in a three-dimensional manner is still to come. It will of course come later in the Renaissance, in the High Renaissance, with Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo and others. The Renaissance painters and sculptors, they would we may say, had discovered how to imitate and represent objects in a three-dimensional manner, and they would represent very realistically all human figures, and after studying human anatomy, and Da Vinci and other painters, they would even participate in dissection of human bodies, corpses, in order to know the anatomy, so that Renaissance painting completely changed from that of Middle Ages, and figures became more and more realistic, three-dimensional, also carried the expressions. The human figures, the human faces carry human expressions. If we look at Renaissance painting, Lukács does not go that far. Lukács limits himself to Giotto and to Byzantine mosaic because that is the threshold when the medieval allegory of representing any reality in an altogether different sense, in a religious sense, that kind of medieval allegorization was overcome when representation of beauty became more important. So in Byzantine mosaic, Lukács says it has an immanence of the decorative arts. it is well executed, beautifully executed, so that there is such an impression on the mind of the viewer. The viewer is overwhelmed by the beautiful execution. So that is a different kind of transcendence, an aesthetic transcendence. Why does Lukács represent these examples as deviation from medieval allegorization? Because Lukács is trying to show the transition or the change in the idea of allegory from the Middle Ages to the modern times. So allegory in the Middle Ages meant that any story, any representation, any poem would represent something at the surface level, but it can be interpreted in a religious manner. When in Giotto the figures became more human, more three-dimensional, then a different value became prominent in such paintings. What is that value? The value of aesthetic representation. How can a human figure, how can a man or a woman be represented more beautifully? That was never the goal of medieval painting. The goal of medieval painting was to somehow represent a story because the ultimate meaning of the painting would be religious. Yes, you were asking something?
Yes, sorry. Sir, I had a question.
Yes.
So does it mean that medieval paintings were very mechanical in nature? As in, I can't figure out the word. I thought this might be. So,
Yes, yes, you may say mechanical, but you have to remember that in the medieval times the artistic techniques of representing a human figure or an animal figure or anything for that matter in a three-dimensional way, those techniques were not yet invented. Perspective was not invented. So these were very important inventions or discoveries, we may say, in the Renaissance, which led to this possibility of creating beautiful works of art where we could easily see how beautifully they are very similar to men, women and animals. In Rome you will find the Trevi Fountain. I think in the Trevi Fountain there are the sculpted statues of horses. Now, if you look at those horses closely, you will see that all the veins have come out. The veins of the horses, they have been represented so realistically. So, how could the artists or sculptors represent animal figures or human figures in such a realistic manner? They could do that only by their close observation of anatomy of human figures, anatomy of animal figures. Only then they could, imitate these figures in this manner. And what was the purpose of these artists? The purpose altered with the availability of this technique, these new techniques of representation, by which anything could be represented in three dimensions. So it is a game changer. Like when young children draw something, human figures or something, they draw in two dimensions, only by lines. They cannot give depth or volume. So that is a higher level of representation. So the drawings of young children are very similar to medieval drawings or paintings. So adding depth, volume to drawing or painting or sculpture, that was a higher level of technique, and when these techniques were available, then human figures or animal figures, they could be represented so beautifully that naturally the goal of the artist changed from representing a moral religious truth to representing something beautiful. And Lucas is looking at this transient stage when the goals are just changing in Giotto and in Byzantine mosaic, where aesthetic immanence became for the first time important in artistic representation, and therefore the meaning of allegory gradually changed, because the earlier meaning of allegory was allegorization of any event, any story, any figure to mean something religious. So it was a religious immanence, a transcendence of a religious type. But then it became aesthetic immanence, where this simply beautiful aesthetic execution became a value. And the further step is modern novels, modernistic writing, where all meaning is taken away, all meaning dissipates, and there is an empty shell of realistic representation, but it does not have the content. So this is another kind of allegorization according to Lucas or Benjamin, where the representation, they do not mean what they represent. They mean, if they mean anything, they mean disintegration. They mean negation. They represent angst, anxiety of being. They do not represent any longer a beautiful world, an aesthetic world. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Alright, so this is mainly the difficulty is because of our less familiarity with European painting art, but otherwise it is not difficult. So allegory in modernist literature is clearly of the latter kind. Transcendence implies here, more or less consciously, the negation of any meaning immanent in the world or the life of man. We have examined the ideological content, ideological basis and stylistic consequences that is in the writings of modernistic novelists like Joyce and Kafka. To conclude our analysis and to establish the allegorical character of modernist literature, I must refer again to the work of one of the finest theoreticians of modernism, Walter Benjamin. So this is the conclusion, and here Benjamin once again becomes important. Benjamin's examination of allegory was a product of his research into German Baroque drama. The book is The Origin of German Tragic Drama, where Benjamin examines the 17th century drama in Germany, which are known as Baroque plays. Benjamin wrote this as a thesis, which would help him get a job, but this great book or this great writing was rejected by obviously very envious professors, and Benjamin never got a job of teaching. So Lucas refers to this work. Benjamin made his analysis of these relatively minor plays the occasion for a general discussion of the aesthetics of allegory. He was asking in effect why it is that transcendence, which is the essence of allegory, cannot but destroy aesthetics itself. So in Baroque drama, that is 17th century German drama, they are all minor works. But it is by studying minor works that it is possible for a critic to understand the principles of development of literature. And Benjamin finds that transcendence, which is the essence of allegory, cannot but destroy aesthetics itself. So this is kind of a dense expression, but we will come to understand it. So right now you can just think that the example of aesthetic immanence that look at, for example, sites in Byzantine art, so how in modernist times that aesthetic immanence is no longer there. So aesthetic immanence is destroyed by allegory. Benjamin gives a very contemporary definition of allegory. He does not labor the analogies between modern art and the Baroque. Such analogies are tenuous at best and were much overdone by the fashionable criticism of the time. So in art history there has been many discussion of the Baroque, but they are all kind of traditional description of the this particular 17th century. Baroque art represents, it also contains lot of decorative materials. It contains theatrical dynamics. That is, it often represents a sudden, point in time which is dramatized, a dramatic moment. We find, for example, in Bernini sculptures, dramatic moments are, represented in sculpture. So it is dramatic, it is decorative. Rather, he uses the Baroque drama to criticize modernism, imputing the characteristics of the latter to the former. So Benjamin compares Baroque with modernism and finds how the characteristics of modernism may be imputed to the Baroque. In so doing, Benjamin becomes the first critic to attempt a philosophical analysis of the aesthetic paradox underlying modernist art. Here is a quotation from Benjamin. In allegory, the facies Hippocratica of history looks to the observer like a petrified primeval landscape. History, all the suffering and failure it contains, finds expression in the human face, or rather in the human skull. No sense of freedom, no classical proportion, no human emotion lives in its features. Facies Hippocratica means the face and the skull under the face. Okay. So, in allegory, Benjamin says that one looks at not only the face but at the skull. So, the facial expression contains suffering or failure and all that. No sense of freedom, no classical proportion, no human emotion lives in its features. Not only the human existence in general, but the fate of every individual human being is symbolized in this most palpable token of mortality. So when we look at the skull, then what do we see? Is there any freedom? Is there any classical proportion or any human emotion there? Nothing. So the skull is the bare token or symbol that reminds one of mortality. This is the core of the allegorical vision of the Baroque idea of history as the passion of the world. So the word allegory can be understood as the skull beneath the skin. So all the coverings of the face which represent the passion and all that, there is something beneath that which is the skull. That is the allegorical way of looking at things. History is significant only in the stations of its corruption. Significance is a function of mortality because it is death that marks the passage from corruptibility to meaningfulness. Very interesting formulation, and to some extent it is also correct, because the medieval worldview was also, was very much engaged with the idea of mortality. So Benjamin says that if we try to understand or read any history in Baroque representation, then what kind of history do we find there? The history of something being corrupted and the various stages of corruption until we reach at the core, and that is the skull, or that is death. So the transition from life of passions to death is the history, and this history is significant insofar as it represents different stages of corruption. So the passage, so it is death which marks the passage from corruptibility to meaningfulness. So death gives meaning to all representation insofar as it presents this passage or this transience from corruption to meaning. Benjamin returns again and again to this link between allegory and the annihilation of history. In the light of this vision, history appears not as the gradual realization of the eternal, but as a process of inevitable decay. Allegory thus goes beyond beauty. What ruins are in the physical world, allegories are in the world of the mind. Very interesting formulation and beautifully expressed. So Benjamin says that if we study Baroque drama, if we study Baroque art, then we see how allegory operates. Allegory gives meaning by pointing at corruption and death. So history does not lead us to any realization of the eternal, but it gives us the process of inevitable decay. So ruins in the physical world, allegories are in the world of the mind. So as ruins tell us of the process of historical decay and destruction, allegory tells us that in our mental world. Benjamin points here to the aesthetic consequences of modernism, though projected into the Baroque drama more shrewdly and consistently than any of his contemporaries. He sees that the notion of objective time is essential to any understanding of history, and that the notion of subjective time is a product of a period of decline. This is a very important observation. I highlighted it. So you remember that in modernistic novel, Lukács found that subjective time is represented, and there is a clash, or there is, we may say, a lack of realistic historical time in modernistic novels. So Benjamin commented that when there is more of subjective time, then it is a mark of decline, and when there is objective time, only that is the representation of history. A thorough knowledge of the problematic nature of art thus becomes for him correctly, from his point of view, one of the hallmarks of allegory in Baroque drama. It is problematic on the one hand because it is an art intent on expressing absolute transcendence that fails to do so because of the means at its disposal. It is also problematic because it is an art reflecting the corruption of the world and bringing about its own dissolution in the process. So in Baroque art, Benjamin found that there are certain problematics. What are the problematic aspects of Baroque art? What problematizations can be found in Baroque art? It reflects corruption of the world and finally brings about its own dissolution. So you can see that Benjamin's point here is that Baroque art leads to the dissolution of art altogether when it arrives at modernism. So he is tracing the path from Baroque to modernism. So the process which begins in Baroque art, that process is that of highlighting the problem or the problematic nature of art. Why is it problematic? Because it tries to express an absolute transcendence, but it fails. Okay. So I was telling you that Baroque art represents something momentary, something dramatic. So always it catches something in a process of movement, but it cannot represent anything in its final transcendence. It fails to attain final transcendence. And ultimately Benjamin thinks that Baroque art leads to the dissolution of art itself as we find in modernism. Benjamin discovers an immense anti-aesthetic subjectivity in Baroque literature associated with a theologically determined subjectivity. We shall presently show a point I have discussed elsewhere in relation to Heidegger's philosophy, how in literature a religious atheism of this kind can acquire a theological character. So these are all, kind of asides that Lucas leaves for the reader without caring to explain them to the reader. So he says that Benjamin has explained how in Baroque art one can find a theologically determined subjectivity, an immense anti-aesthetic subjectivity in Baroque literature associated with theologically determined subjectivity. So, this will not be very clear until we clearly understand what is Baroque art. So Benjamin finds a process of decay in Baroque art and an anti-aesthetic attitude insofar as Baroque art represents this decay and corruption. And this anti-aesthetic subjectivity, according to Benjamin, is associated with a theologically determined subjectivity. That is not difficult to understand. In the Middle Ages, in the 17th century also, theology dominated over all other modes of thinking. Theological thinking dominated every mode of thinking, and therefore this theologically determined subjectivity was associated with the anti-aesthetic subjectivity of the Baroque. So I am leaving aside this, Lukács' aside in the within the brackets, Heidegger's philosophy, how in literature religious atheism of this kind can acquire a theological character. Probably what he wants to mean is that the anti-aesthetic, the atheistic attitude, that itself becomes a kind of religion in Heidegger's philosophy, and it becomes kind of theological. It attains a theological character. Okay, so we need not go deep into that. Basically, what he means is that in Heidegger's philosophy, even atheism tends to become a kind of religious attitude. Romantic and on a higher plane Baroque writers were well aware of this problem and gave their understanding not only theoretical but artistic, that is to say allegorical expression. So what is the problem? The problem that in art there is always a possibility of an anti-aesthetic attitude, and to counter this, Romantics and Baroque artists or writers, they tried to give their understanding theoretical and artistic expression. I am trying to repeat and trying to explain this once again. The process of decay which could be discovered in Baroque art, or the awareness of decay which we find in Baroque art, which is a kind of anti-aesthetic subjectivity. Because of this awareness, Romantics and Baroque writers, they write or create allegorically by giving artistic expression to their understanding. The image, Benjamin remarks, becomes a rule in the sphere of allegorical intuition. So, rune, you know, in Middle Ages there were runes which were letters or characters, kind of symbolical letters. So a rune is something which has to be deciphered, kind of mark or a character which has to be properly read. So Benjamin says that the image becomes a rune in the sphere of allegorical intuition. So an image needs to be, or it waits for being interpreted in allegorical manner through intuition. When touched by the light of theology, its symbolic beauty is gone. The false appearance of totality vanishes, the image dies, the parable no longer holds true, the world it once contained disappears. The image is beautiful, waiting for allegorical interpretation, only so long as it is not interpreted by theology. The moment one tries to interpret the image theologically, then its symbolic beauty is gone, its aesthetic immanence is gone, and it cannot be understood any longer in its totality. So it cannot hold as a parable. That is, if you try to explain this work of art or this writing theologically, then it falls apart, it does not have any sense, it does not have any meaning in the way a parable has a meaning. So what is the point here? That image becomes like a rune, that is something which must be deciphered, but it cannot be deciphered with the help of theology. Why? Because image or art is anti-theological. It is the theological meaning has decayed. So when does this process start? In the 17th century. That is, the way art could be represented, could be deciphered, could be interpreted allegorically. And by interpreting art allegorically, a religious significance could be extracted from it in the Middle Ages. That started decaying in the 17th century with Baroque drama, with Baroque art, and this process of decay arrived at its climax with modernism. So the symbolic beauty which can be read in medieval allegory, in Baroque drama this symbolic beauty cannot be read if we try to give it any theological interpretation. The consequences for art are far-reaching, and Benjamin does not hesitate to point them out. Every person, every object, every relationship can stand for something else. This transferability constitutes the devastating, though just judgment on the profane world, which is thereby branded as a world where such things are of small importance. Okay, so what is this? This is the very definition of allegory. In allegory, everything has a meaning, everything stands for something else. Every person, every object, every relationship stands for something else. That is why we can give allegorical meaning to the poems of the Middle Ages, a religious meaning. So this transferability constitutes a devastating thus judgment on the profane world, which is thereby branded as a world where such things are of small importance. So in the profane world, that is the world which loves an image for its aesthetic appeal, not for its religious. In the profane world, this allegory loses its importance. Benjamin knows, of course, that although details are transferable and thus insignificant, they are not banished from art altogether. On the contrary, precisely in modern art, with which he is ultimately concerned, descriptive detail is often of an extraordinary sensuous, suggestive power. We think again of Kafka. So we have come full circle. The purpose of Lukács using Benjamin was to come to an interpretation of modernism. So the sensuous, realistic details we see in Kafka, Joyce, when Lukács comes to that by holding the hands of Benjamin. So Benjamin said that allegory meant that every detail would have a different meaning. There is a transferability, but in the profane world, this allegory came to lose all importance. And that is what happens in modern art or modernistic art. You may read here modernistic novel, where the descriptive details, even though they are sensuous, but they do not have any theological meaning. And the example of that is Kafka and Musil. But this, as we showed in the case of Musil, a writer who does not consciously aim at allegory, does not prevent the materiality of the world from undergoing permanent alteration, from becoming transferable and arbitrary. So, you remember Musil's novel, A Man Without Qualities? So in Musil's novel, even though it is not allegorical consciously, but there is a process of alteration and everything becomes transferable and arbitrary. Just this, modernist writers maintain, is typical of their own apprehension of reality. So the modernists do not find any stable meaning of reality. To them, everything appears to be transferable, everything appears to be arbitrary, and that is the allegorical process. So now we understand why Lukács and Benjamin use the term allegory while referring to modernistic novels. Yet presented in this way, the world becomes, as Benjamin puts it, exalted and depreciated at the same time. Benjamin is a very keen observer. So modernism does not mean for him only depreciation, but also exaltation. And Lukács following him, even though he perhaps does not see any exaltation, I do not know, in modernity, he has to accept. So exalted and depreciated at the same time, but the conviction that phenomena are not ultimately transferable is rooted in a belief in the world's rationality and in man's ability to penetrate its secrets. So if we believe in rationality and we believe in man's ability to understand the world, then that is a conviction that all phenomena are not transferable. But as we will see that this is a naive belief. In realistic literature, each descriptive detail is both individual and typical. Modern allegory and modernist ideology, however, deny the typical. So, the typical is something which we find in realistic literature, whether it is Ben Jonson, whether it is neoclassical drama of the 17th century France, type characters. What do they stand for? They stand for some features, some truth that can be extracted from any representation. But individual suggests that each and every individual is different. And realism always means that individual reality as well as typical reality would be represented. Modernist writers, they accept the individual but deny the typical. So what is the typical? The type character stands for a great number of individuals. Say the type of miser, the type character miser in Moliere's play. Moliere has a play called The Miser. Now, you can realistically depict misers. So, in 10 different works, you can depict 10 different characters who are misers. All of them are different. So, that is also realistic description. But if, like Moliere, you describe a miser as a type character, then that character stands for all these different misers. That is another way of realism, realistically depicting a miser character. The type character includes in it, or it pays attention to the community of misers, but the individual miser depicted in 10 individual plays, 10 different kinds of misers, they do not represent the community, they represent the individual. Each work represents an individual. Modernistic writing or in modernistic ideology, the communality, the community is denied, is rejected. Therefore, they reject the typical. By destroying the coherence of the world, they reduce detail to the level of mere particularity. Once again, the connection between modernism and naturalism is plain. If you reduce or if you destroy the coherence of this world, that is, say 10 different misers live in this town, but this town has a coherence. So all these 10 belong to this town. But you destroy the coherence and you destroy the idea of the town or the community, and you say that here is a random miser, there is another random miser. So you do not connect these 10 misers together in a community. So you are only emphasizing on particularity. You are disregarding the connection between these different particulars. And that is the method of naturalism. Naturalism refuses to look at things organically, holistically. It looks at particulars, microscopically. And realism looks at things organically, not only at particulars. So in this respect, Lukács says modernism is very similar to naturalism. Because modernism also rejects the coherence. Detail in its allegorical transferability, though brought into a direct if paradoxical connection with transcendence, becomes an abstract function of the transcendence to which it points. So this whole discussion is on the question of details. How do we look at or interpret details, realistic details in Kafka's work, in Joyce's work, or in medieval literature, or in Thomas Mann. So the ideology is different. in every case. In the case of medieval literature, allegory suggests transparent. Each and every detail can be transferred to a different meaning, and finally they can have a transcendent meaning. There would be a coherence. In works like Thomas Mann also, even though he uses modernist technique, there is coherence. But in case of other modernistic writers, even though there are a lot of realistic details, there is no coherence. So it is the outlook, the worldview, or the philosophy which is different in these different writers. So detail and its allegorical transferability, though brought into a direct, if paradoxical connection with transcendence, becomes an abstract function of the transcendence to which it points. So in modernistic writing, details do not lead us to any transcendent meaning, because it becomes an abstract function of transcendence. Modernist literature thus replaces concrete typicality with abstract particularity. This is a very clear statement. Concrete typicality cannot be found in modernist literature. Even though there are details, those details are only abstract particularity. So you can understand that in works like Kafka or Joyce, you cannot place the details provided in a particular social historical context. But take the example of Thomas Mann in Dr. Faustus, the time narrated and the time of narration. So the time narrated is the historical context, which can be viewed from the time of narration. So that that method of representing details as concrete or typical, that is absent in the other modernistic writers. We are here applying Benjamin's paradox directly to aesthetics and criticism, and particularly the aesthetics of modernism. And though we have reversed the scale of values, we have not deviated from the course of his argument. Elsewhere he speaks out even more plainly, though the Baroque mask had fallen, revealing the modernist skull underneath. So it is really very plain. The Baroque is a process that led to the modernism of today, of the 20th century. So Lucas says that Benjamin has clearly said that the modernist skull can be seen. Allegory is left empty-handed, the forces of evil lurking in its depths owe their very existence to allegory. Evil is precisely the non-existence of that which allegory purports to represent. So Benjamin says that in modernist writing, allegory is empty-handed. What does allegory represent? What does it decipher? So the absence of that is evil. So the forces of evil which were underneath in allegory, they have come to the surface, and now they have made it clear that what allegory tried to represent, that is absent, that is not there. So what is non-existent? Meaning is non-existent. Context is non-existent. Significance is non-existent. Transcendence is non-existent. So, according to Benjamin, in modernistic writing, we find that we have seen allegory clearly through it, that it has led to our understanding that what allegory wanted to represent, that is absent, and this absence is the evil. The paradox Benjamin arrives at is investigation of the aesthetics of Baroque tragedy as culminated in a negation of aesthetics. Sheds a good deal of light on modernist literature and particularly on Kafka in interpreting his writings allegorically. I am not, of course, following Max Brod, who finds a specifically religious allegory in Kafka's works. Now, if you read Benjamin's works on Kafka, Benjamin wrote a review of Max Brod's book on Kafka. Max Brod interpreted Kafka in terms of religious allegory, and obviously Benjamin objected to that interpretation. Lukács says that he is not following Max Brod, who finds a religious allegory in Kafka. Kafka refuted any such interpretation and remark, which he is said to have made to Brod himself. We are nihilistic figments, all of us, suicidal notions forming in God's mind. So Kafka himself rejected Max Brod's interpretation of his works, that his works have some, religious meaning. By his comment, we are nihilistic figments, all of us. We are suicidal notions in God's mind. So, the origin of modernism, we may say, to a large extent, the nihilistic intellectual tradition fully given expression by Nietzsche, that is, we may say, the philosophical source of modernism. And to some extent, Heidegger can also be called a child of Nietzsche. Kafka acknowledges this nihilism in his work. Kafka rejected too the Gnostic concept of God as an evil demiurge. The world is a cruel whim of God and evil day's work. So, Kafka rejects this concept of God as somebody whimsically creating this world. When Brod attempted to give this an optimistic slant, Kafka shrugged off the attempt ironically. Oh, hope enough, hope without end, but not alas for us. So any attempt to optimistically explain his works was rejected. So he says that hope is not for us. It is by us, of course he meant the modernist writers. From their work, no immanent meaning can be extracted. These remarks, quoted by Benjamin in his brilliant essay on Kafka, point to the general spiritual climate of his work. His profoundest experience of the hopelessness, the utter meaninglessness of man's world, and particularly that of present-day bourgeois man. So this is a quotation from Benjamin. And obviously, Benjamin, being a Marxist writer, is happy with this explanation of Kafka's work, that his work represents the hopelessness, the meaninglessness that one finds in the bourgeois world. Kafka, whether he says so openly or not, is an atheist. An atheist, though, of that modern species, who regard God's removal from the scene not as a liberation, as did Epicurus and the encyclopedists, but as a token of the God-forsakenness of the world, its desolation of futility. So, Kafka did not look upon the absence of God as a liberation, but God-forsakenness of the world. So the futility of the world. Obviously, after this realization, post-enlightenment in Nietzsche spoke of the death of God in Das Specks Zarathustra. And after that, this realization of the godlessness and therefore the meaninglessness of morality and all that, there was a vacuum in modern philosophy and a hopelessness which found representation in modernistic literature. Jakobsen's Niels Line was the first novel to describe the state of mind of the atheistic bourgeois intelligentsia. So now I will redirect you to the notes, and Niels Line is an 1880 novel written by the Danish author Jens Peter Jakobsen. A naturalistic work, Niels Line is considered to be part of the modern breakthrough, a style of realism native to Scandinavia. The novel does contain several romantic elements, and it relies and expands on romantic themes, examination of individual struggle and consciousness, artistic expression and inspiration, while it also ironizes them. The story chronicles the titular character's renunciation of his faith, his various bereavements, and ultimately it depicts his disillusionment and his death. This disillusionment is part and parcel of the work's naturalism, focusing on his failure as a lover and as an artist. Niels Line demonstrates the individual's helplessness and serves as a critique of atheism as well as fate. Georg Lukács cites this novel in his book. The first novel to describe the state of mind of the atheistic bourgeois intelligentsia. So we have kind of cross-reference. So Niels Line was the first novel to describe the state of mind of the atheistic bourgeois intelligentsia. Modern religious atheism is characterized on the one hand by the fact that unbelief has lost its revolutionary elan. The empty heavens are the projection of a world beyond hope of redemption. On the other hand, religious atheism shows that the desire for salvation lives on with undiminished force in a world without God, worshipping the voice created by God's absence. Okay. So we find here a concept which is not very familiar to us, religious atheism, okay, which is expressed in Jakobsen's novel Niels Line, that rejects conventional atheism, that is the idea of godlessness. Religious atheism represents a longing for the world where God would be there. So, a desire for salvation lives on in a world without God, worshipping the voice created by God's absence. So, religious atheism does not believe in God, but believes that still salvation is possible in some way. So, I think I will stop here today, and I will finish the rest in the next class, and also discuss the questions. Alright. So if you have any questions, you can ask.